For those who make a life on the water, danger isn't some abstract concept. Rather, I have to imagine it's more of a companion, one you're not entirely fond of, mind you. And while the dangers of open water are most often commonly thought of alongside the world's oceans, you'd be incorrect to assume that because Lake Michigan is smaller than many oceans, that it's any safer. Rather, Lake Michigan, much like an ocean, has a jagged history, shaped by sudden storms, freezing waters, and a long history of ships, people, and aircraft that never made it back, and in some cases, that probably never should have existed in the first place. And while, to many, these dangers are somewhat quantifiable, being a function of wind, waves, and often poor decisions, to others they're defined in geometric patterns, in a triangle. Now I'm sure you've heard of these before, the Bermuda Triangle, or in this channel, the Bennington and Bridgewater Triangles. There are many of these notorious regions the world across, and stretching between Manitowoc, Wisconsin, east to Ludington, and then south to Benton Harbor, Michigan, many say there is also one that calls this Great Lake home. Here, as noted, history isn't pretty. Vessels, whether by air or sea, seem to have a knack for losing their way, and if that's not strange enough, there are also strange artifacts that have been found inside of the lake, and, of course, some strange aerial phenomena observed that make you wonder if rather than something, it might be someone that's been causing all of these so-called accidents. Now, even before Europeans came to the Americas, these lakes were a place that the Native Americans considered dangerous and respected. To the Ojibwe, for instance, it's documented that they, at least metaphorically, considered the lake to be alive. They said it had moods and rhythms like a person. One day it might feel generous, but the next it might be wrathful. And in some tellings, they even proposed the lake's mood might have been the manifestation of ancestral spirits' feelings about how they were going about their business. For example, some Ojibwe elders even proposed that rowing or sailing during specific lunar phases might provoke storms. This was paired with the thought that some places, often rock formations, reefs, or specific islands, were inhabited by spirits and were off-limits. In addition to these warnings, there are stories in the Great Lakes of creatures. Now, let me be clear, these stories are often presented as a general fact about the Great Lakes, rather than just of Lake Michigan, but they tell of beings to be revered and feared, often in equal measure, that call these lakes and their shores home. Most famous, perhaps, is the legend of the Great Horned Spirit. These legends vary from tribe to tribe, but it was generally told by all of them, and they pretty much all describe the same thing. A huge dragon-like or snake-like beast, often layered with scales, with horns, and with large, sharp teeth. Native legend tells that this creature, sometimes called the Mishipeshu, wasn't just physically fierce, but held the supernatural ability to control the weather, shapeshift, offer powers to others, and sometimes even turn invisible. And it's said they resided deep in the waters of Lake Michigan, or sometimes on specific islands. Oh, and they had a particular fondness for the mineral copper. Alongside these legends, too, there are tales of other creatures, of thunderbirds, large fish, and even small people that wander the coasts of the Great Lakes. While I'll leave it up to you if you believe these native legends, my takeaway is the following. In the wise eyes of America's original residents, the Great Lakes were a place to be respected, or else, and it didn't take long for European visitors to learn this the hard way. In the winter of 1678 and spring of 1679, René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle commissioned and began building a ship named Le Griffin, a ship that would become one of Lake Michigan's greatest mysteries. The details surrounding this ship, such as its size and construction, are, to be abundantly clear, not entirely known, though Le Griffin is usually painted as being a 45-ton bark with a single mast and several square sails. It was probably 30 to 40 feet long with about a 10 to 15 foot beam. As for Le Griffin's purpose, it was twofold. On one hand, it would allow La Salle to create a fur trading monopoly with the native people of the Great Lakes, something that was meant to fund his real ambition, which was his ongoing quest to find the Northwest Passage, which would lead him through the Americas to China and Japan. Ambition aside, though, prior to Le Griffin, Europeans had only navigated the Great Lakes via canoe. Le Griffin, in contrast, would be the first full-sized sailing ship on the upper Great Lakes of North America, paving the path towards opening up commercial shipping lanes to the communities along Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, and to collect fur from the region's native tribes. Le Griffin was first launched on the Niagara River, upon which La Salle and Father Louis Hennepin would sail with a crew of 32 on August 7th of 1679, from Niagara, across Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and ultimately into Lake Michigan. This journey would start with a near snag, with the large ship initially having trouble navigating the shallow waters of the St. Clair River, and it was almost sunk during a squall on Lake Huron. That said, it would charge forward, eventually landing at Washington Island at the mouth of the Green Bay on September 2nd of 1679. Here, the crew would anchor off of its south shore and would trade with some Potawatomi natives for roughly 12,000 pounds of fur. After this, La Salle would stay behind with 4 canoes to explore the head of Lake Michigan, and after riding out a violent storm for 4 days on September 18th of 1679, the ship's pilot and a crew of 5 would sail away, under favorable wind conditions, for Fort Frontenac, a French trading post and military fort near where the St. Lawrence River leaves Lake Ontario, giving a single-gun parting salute as they departed. Aboard was fur, explosives, and some rigging anchors for another vessel La Salle intended to build to find the Northwest Passage. Nobody would ever see Le Griffin, nor the crew members aboard, ever again, making Le Griffin perhaps the first casualty, at least European one, of the infamous Lake Michigan Triangle. As for what happened to it, theories range widely. Father Hennepin, for example, would actually write at the time that Le Griffin was lost in a violent storm. There was also speculation that local natives might have boarded the ship to loot its cargo, making off with the fur, and burning the ship to the depths of Lake Michigan. There were also some who claimed to see Le Griffin or its crew. For one, some nearby tribesmen claimed they saw a boat sail into a violent storm, later finding hatch covers and spoiled pelts at shore. Further, in a 1683 letter, La Salle would be voiced a more concerning story, being told that a nearby village had been visited by a neighboring tribe, who had captive Frenchmen carrying pelts and explosives, both of which Le Griffin had aboard. One of the men apparently matched the description of the ship's pilot, a man referred to as Luke the Dane. La Salle therefore thought that Luke may have sabotaged the ship to sell the furs himself, and for the rest of La Salle's life, he believed his crew committed mutiny and burned the ship to the bottom of the lake shortly after setting off. There are even claims Le Griffin has been found, but those, of course, are unconfirmed. In the late 1890s, one Albert Cullis, the keeper of the Mississauga Strait Lighthouse in Ontario, off of Lake Huron rather than Lake Michigan, found a watch chain entangled in the roots of a tree, and underneath, buried in dirt, he found 3 small metal tokens marked with 17th century dates. After more searching, Cullis also found a cave with 4 skeletons and another nearby with 2 more skeletons, and of course, more tokens and tools. This man thought these 6 skeletons may be associated with the 6 crew members of Le Griffin, who possibly abandoned ship on this fateful day. And one of these skeletons, of course, was quite large, which is fishy, given that man Luke we talked about was rumored to be nearly 7 feet tall. This was actually reported in newspapers as a confirmed remnant of Le Griffin's final voyage. And a bolt found amongst these items was even sent to the Louvre in Paris for analysis, which couldn't determine if it was from Le Griffin, but they did show the bolt was consistent with 17th century French shipbuilding. If this is truly the case, this may very well be Le Griffin, as this was the only European ship in Lake Michigan or Lake Huron at the time. That said, while this sounds promising, there are dozens of other wrecks in the Great Lakes that claim to be Le Griffin, some with ongoing legal battles regarding their excavations between the state of Michigan, the federal government, and the government of France. And to date, None of these are even close to conclusive. For now, what happened to Le Griffin is a mystery, perhaps the first disappearance of the Lake Michigan Triangle, and it sort of remains the holy grail, or perhaps more appropriately, the white whale of Great Lakes shipwreck hunters. There, too, are other shipwrecks on Lake Michigan that are less notorious for their mystery and more for the fact that their death toll was literally 50 times that of the Griffin, showing that while this notorious lake occasionally spits its food out rather than making it disappear, it always likes to chew. On September 7th of 1860, a steamboat named the Lady Elgin would depart Chicago just before midnight, taking a relatively short and regular trek towards Milwaukee to the north with nearly 400 passengers aboard, returning after a long day in the city. This evening, visibility was poor. There were large waves and a brewing storm, and while on their trek, they would see another boat, a schooner named the Augusta, that was heavy and filled with lumber at around 2:30 a.m. Despite the fact that both of these boats had plenty of warning, the Augusta's lumber load shifted, changing its trajectory and causing the two craft to collide. Within minutes, the passengers of the Lady Elgin would have their day shift from one of fun in the city to a fight for their lives, with the craft sustaining a massive hull, taking on a ton of water, and completely sinking within an hour. There were only 3 lifeboats for the 400 passengers, and the large upper hurricane deck also fell into the water on its own, serving as a makeshift raft for some. Here, about 2 to 3 miles off the shore of Highland Park, a fight for survival would ensue that most would lose. Strong waves and the ship's debris alike battered survivors, sending their bodies and the ship's debris to the north shore of Winnetka, some 5 or so miles to the south. The first lifeboats would make it to shore at around 6:30 a.m. near the Jared Gage House, a home that still stands today at 1174 White Bridge Hill Road, and they would hail for assistance. Town residents would also rally, getting young men from across the community to help pull out survivors, and the newly completed Chicago to Milwaukee train line, admittedly probably the preferable choice for a stormy evening as opposed to a boat, if I do say so myself, would bring people to Winnetka to assist with the accident. And while they were able to help some, the storm created a terrible undertow, and many of those ashore could observe victims drifting just close enough to Winnetka's shore to see them and even yell out to them, but they couldn't cross the breakers, and they would ultimately pass away in full view of those ashore. In the aftermath, the home of Winnetka residents, like the home that is today the Artemis Carter House at 515 Sheridan Road, served as hospitals, and roughly 302 individuals perished, a number that was more than double Winnetka's population. Whether maritime misadventure or the Lake Michigan Triangle rearing its head once again, one thing was certain: this string of bad luck on the lake was becoming a pattern. In a similar, though less dramatic light, there was also the Thomas Hume. The Thomas Hume was built in 1870 in Manitowoc by shipbuilder Joseph Hansen. The vessel was originally named the H.C. Albrecht, after its first owner, Captain Harry C. Albrecht. At 132 feet long, with a 26-foot beam, it was not remarkable in design, but it was sturdy, practical, and built for the booming lumber trade that defined the Great Lakes back then. For context, in these years, Lake Michigan was practically a piece of infrastructure. Forests in Michigan were being stripped and shipped south and west, fueling the explosive growth of cities like Chicago. Schooners like the Hume were the arteries of that expansion, moving timber across the lake in an endless cycle. Now, ownership of the vessel changed hands more than once in its early years, eventually landing with the Hackley Hume Lumber Company in Muskegon. Under their direction, the ship was reinforced, refitted, and expanded. A third mast was added, its framing was strengthened, the deck was replaced. It was under this ownership, too, that in 1883 it was renamed the Thomas Hume. And for years, it did exactly what it was supposed to do, with very little drama. It carried lumber back and forth, Muskegon to Chicago, and Chicago to Muskegon. It was predictable, repetitive, and reliable, until it wasn't. On May 21st of 1891, the Thomas Hume sat in Chicago, having just completed another delivery. Its cargo was unloaded, and its hull was light, with its crew of only 7 men remaining. Nearby, too, another schooner from that same organization prepared for the same return journey, the Rouse Simmons. The two ships were part of that same organization, and they ran the same route, under the same pressures of time and profit. But that day, the lake was changing. A storm was brewing, and dark clouds were gathering over the open water, the kind that experienced captains learned to respect. Thus, the captain of the Rouse Simmons made the decision to wait. The captain of the Thomas Hume, though, made a different decision, and left port. The ship departed Chicago and moved out onto Lake Michigan, heading north towards Muskegon, directly into worsening weather. 2 days later, when the storm had passed, the Rouse Simmons finally made its own journey north. The expectation was pretty simple. The Thomas Hume would already be there, tied up along the docks of Muskegon Lake, its crew likely halfway through unloading or already ashore. But when they arrived, there was nothing. No ship, no crew, and where the Thomas Hume should have been docked, there was an empty spot. Of course, search efforts began immediately, and the Hackley Hume Company dispatched Captain Seth Lee to comb the lake for the vessel, but the lake offered him nothing. They found no debris, no bodies, no wood, no cargo remnants, or even lifeboats. The ship and all 7 men aboard had vanished. And again, speculation was rampant, with folks proposing that it had been seized and repainted, or maybe struck by a freighter and buried in the lake. And perhaps for the first time, you can find speculation in print that maybe the lake itself had decided to take the Hume. They didn't say Lake Michigan Triangle, mind you, but they inferred something similar. And for over a century, the Thomas Hume would remain like this, as nothing but a question, blending into the lake's lore that it liked to swallow things. That is, until 2005. That year, a diver named Tara Lysenko, working with AT&T Recovery, identified something resting on the lake bed about 20 to 25 miles offshore of New Buffalo. A ship that was upright, intact, and borderline preserved in the cold depths of the lake 200 feet below the surface. When examined, the details were sort of unsettling in their normalcy. Tools, coins, personal items, all of it. Everything seemed to be exactly where it should have been. There weren't any signs of collision, of structural failure, or of anything really that might have sent this vessel to the depths of the lake. It looked less like a wreck, and more like the boat had been placed here and paused in time. This ship, of course, after 115 years, was the Thomas Hume. But finding it was only part of the mystery. Perhaps the most important question was never answered. What on earth happened to send the Thomas Hume to the depths of Lake Michigan? To this day, we genuinely do not know, and thus, some wonder if, kind of like a curious toddler, the lake just reached up with its wet hands and pulled it down inside. And remember the Rouse Simmons, that other ship that declined to depart Chicago alongside the Thomas Hume? Well, in 1891, as we've covered, it stood at the edge of that same decision that ultimately doomed the Thomas Hume, to sail into poor conditions or wait. That day, the Rouse Simmons captain chose caution, and the Rouse Simmons stayed in port. Thus, at least for a time, this ship and the crew would live to sail another day. But rest assured, their time was coming. By 1812, the Rouse Simmons had changed hands, and thus it had a different purpose. It was no longer a working vessel devoted to the lumber trade in the same capacity. Rather, it was now under the partial ownership of one Captain Herman Schoenman, a man who'd spent decades in a different type of lumber industry, Christmas trees. And under his lead, the Rouse Simmons became something seasonal and recognizable in Chicago. Each year, as winter approached, Schoenman would load the schooner with fir trees, harvested from the forests of northern Michigan and Wisconsin, and sail them down to Chicago. But unlike most merchants, he didn't deal in bulk. Rather, he sold directly to people. Dockside, near the Clark Street Bridge, families would gather near the Rouse Simmons to buy trees straight from the ship. Prices were low, often between about 50 cents and $1. And for those who couldn't afford that, Hume was known to simply give them away. He advertised with a slogan, as plain as it was effective: "Christmas tree ship, my prices are the lowest." And over time, he earned a nickname that followed him through the city each winter: Captain Santa. But despite the Christmas tree salesman being an outwardly cheerful job, it wasn't without its risks. See, Captain Herman Hume had not entered this business alone. For years, he actually worked alongside his brother, August, until August was lost himself in Lake Michigan, caught in a storm near Glencoe one year. In other words, the lake had already taken one Hume, and little did the so-called Captain Santa know, it was only a matter of time until it would take another. It's with this backdrop, on November 22nd of 1912, that the Rouse Simmons prepared for its final voyage. Ownership of the vessel was now shared. Hume and Captain Charles Nelson each held a portion of the ship, with the remainder belonging to a businessman from St. James. But operationally, this was still Hume's run, his cargo, his route, and of course, his risk. This evening, by most accounts, conditions were poor, dangerous even, and winds were expected to reach 60 miles an hour across the lake due to a November gale, a type of storm that most wise or experienced sailors would have chosen to avoid. Further, there were whispers that the Rouse Simmons itself was in poor condition, and reports from a few years prior suggested it had a possibly undiagnosed issue that would cause it to ride dangerously low in the water when loaded up with trees. Taken together, it was clear: of all the things Captain Hume could have done, leaving in these conditions wasn't one of them. Yet, at noon, the Rouse Simmons would depart anyways. According to accounts, Christmas trees, hundreds of them, were packed into every available space aboard the schooner. They were lashed to the deck, wedged into the ship's hold, and stacked beyond what this vessel should have been carrying. It was very clearly top-heavy, and of course exposed to the wind. And then it was gone. That said, by the afternoon of November 23rd, the Rouse Simmons was spotted off the coast near Kewanee. But what those at shore saw wasn't encouraging. The ship's flag flew at half-mast, a distress signal, and further, these masts were torn, and it was riding low in the water. The life-saving station at Kewanee responded about as quickly as it could, but their own rescue tugboat had already left earlier in the day, meaning they needed to ask for help from a nearby station. However, by the time that station responded, the Rouse Simmons had already disappeared from view. And unlike the Thomas Hume, this time the lake did give some clues as to what happened. In the weeks that followed, pieces began to surface. In December of 1912, Christmas trees washed ashore near Pintwater, still bound as they had been on the ship, and fishermen in the years after would occasionally, by mistake, haul in nets tangled with remnants of these trees. On a beach in Sheboygan even, a wallet was recovered, wrapped carefully in oilskin, and inside there were personal effects of Captain Hume. Ultimately, it would take nearly 6 decades for the ship itself to be found, though. In 1971, using sonar equipment, a diver from Milwaukee located a wreck resting 172 feet below the surface of Lake Michigan. It was the Rouse Simmons, and the wreck told a clear story. The mast had snapped above the deck, and the base of the main mast was missing entirely. This indicated structural failure, likely under the combined stress of violent winds, heavy cargo, and ice-covered rigging. As you might expect, the trees, bound tightly to the deck, likely worsened the situation, catching wind like sails, shifting weight, and destabilizing the vessel. In other words, ironically, it's possible that the Christmas trees this ship was so well known for peddling may have dragged the Rouse Simmons into the depths of Lake Michigan, much like its old friend, the Thomas Hume. And like a time capsule within the hold of the ship, many of these old Christmas trees remain waterlogged but intact. One was even recovered and then displayed in a Milwaukee Bank's counting room during the 1971 Christmas season, decades after it was loaded for sale. Today, like many ships at the bottom of the lake, the Christmas tree ship remains a stark reminder that even the smallest lapse in judgment is enough for Lake Michigan to send you to its depths. And while many ships sink to the depths of the lake, such as the Thomas Hume and the Rouse Simmons, there are others still that are even more mysterious. Ships that are found long after being lost, but are seemingly, in a way, untouched. Typically, they're only missing one crucial thing: their crews. The schooner Rosabelle falls into this class. Now, the Rosabelle began its life without incident. On April 12th of 1863, this modest, 100-foot-long vessel was launched in Milwaukee and provided transportation for lumber and grain reliably for years. It even survived what should have been its end, when in 1875 the Rosabelle ran aground in a storm near Grand Haven, causing damage so severe that contemporary reports described it as gone to pieces, and that newsprints of the era reported its captain as sustaining broken ribs and suffering head trauma. Despite this presumably significant damage, though, the Rosabelle was rebuilt and relaunched the following year in 1876, and it continued its work for decades to follow. That said, by 1919 the ship had found a new role and a new kind of owner. It was purchased by the House of David Colony, a religious community based in Benton Harbor, which used the vessel for supply runs across Lake Michigan, moving goods between ports in a quiet, routine pattern. Keep in mind, though, at this point the Rosabelle was nothing more than a repaired and reinforced, yet very old and continually aging ship. Thus, on October 30th of 1921, when the Rosabelle departed from High Island, loaded with maple lumber bound for Benton Harbor, little did its 9 crew members know, but they would never see the shore again. That night, a gale moved across Lake Michigan, something that isn't unusual for October. And on November 1st, the Rosabelle was found. That said, it was overturned, floating bottom up about 40 miles east of Milwaukee, but with its hull intact enough to remain buoyant, and its lifeboats missing. Its crew, of course, were gone. There was apparently some sign of damage on its stern, but otherwise it seemed to be in perfect condition. Further, while some thought it looked as if the Rosabelle collided with another ship, there were no other vessels in the region that reported damage, and no secondary wreckage at all. Thus, given these facts, the Coast Guard ruled out collision entirely. With that, the Rosabelle was flipped upright, and then sometime afterwards, it drifted towards Kenosha, where it was towed into Racine Harbor, and the lumber aboard was taken, and parts of the ship were salvaged. Here, the ship was further inspected, confirming that the hull, while damaged a bit, was not destroyed at all, and that while the rigging was torn loose, and there was a bit of damage to the cabin, there was really nothing that would have explained why the entire crew would have been lost or why the craft even turned over in the first place. Further, no bodies were ever found in connection to this shipwreck. This oddity, of course, took what was otherwise a story of a shipwreck and turned it into something else, a mystery of what exactly could have caused a boat of this size to flip, and for all of those aboard to likely flee to lifeboats, which were also never found. As far as explanations go, well, they didn't explain much. Some suggested a ghost ship, an unlit, drifting vessel moving through the storm that was practically invisible, until the moment of collision at least. Others claimed they had a literal run-in with smugglers, who wouldn't have reported this collision in the first place. There's also speculation of phenomena like time slips, or that some creature may have reached its tendrils up to grab a quick snack from the boat's deck. That said, the most likely explanation is that something, rather than someone, was responsible, and that rather than a creature, human or otherwise, the ocean itself was to blame. Judging from the damage, it seems likely that a powerful wave or extremely strong downdraft of wind, without warning, took hold of the Rosabelle, which was already an old vessel with a long history of damage and repair, destroying part of its structure, destabilizing its hull, and causing it to roll, throwing its crew along with it into the dark nighttime waters of Lake Michigan, where they would have had minutes to react at most. Perhaps they reached the lifeboat, but perhaps more likely, the wave or wind also ripped those from the side of the boat, casting them and the crew into the lonely waters of the lake. And if the Rosabelle leaves us with the unsettling image of a ship found without its crew, the next case takes that absence a little step further, because this time it isn't a crew that vanishes into Lake Michigan, it's the captain alone. This story begins on the cold evening of April 28th of 1937, aboard the O.S. McFarland, a freighter, making its way across Lake Michigan to a power plant in Port Washington, Wisconsin, hauling 9,800 tons of coal aboard, which originated in Erie, Pennsylvania. This April, Lake Michigan was partially frozen, something that wasn't necessarily dangerous, but that slowed the McFarland's progress. That said, by all accounts, she was in capable hands, being under the command of Captain George R. Donor, a 57-year-old captain that was both very experienced and, funny as it was, about to turn 58 on this very voyage. Donor had been a captain on the Great Lakes for decades, having worked for a number of local companies, and ultimately in 1937, he was given the rank of captain by the Columbia Transportation Company, who also gave him full command over the O.S. McFarland, George's first official voyage of this season under the Columbia Transportation Co. was this trek from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin, which he would begin on April 25th. Now, back to April 28th. At around 10:20 p.m., after just successfully navigating through the Straits of Mackinac, Captain Donor had the ship's speed lowered and would step away from his post after hours of navigating this large freighter through the nearly frozen strait. He'd then inform his first and second mate that he'd be retiring to his cabin to sleep, and told them to wake him up when they passed Sheboygan and began approaching Port Washington, something he thought would take about 3 hours. He was clearly confident at this point that his crew was capable of handling the remainder of the voyage on their own. Thus, after giving these instructions, George would step away and would make his way towards his cabin, located at the back of the pilot house, and down a companionway, shutting the wooden door behind him as he entered. Following this, the coming hours went on without incident, and just as planned, at around 1:20 a.m., the ship would begin its approach to Port Washington. Following the captain's orders, the ship's second mate went to Donor's cabin to wake him. The man knocked, and there was no answer. And then he knocked again, and again. There was no answer. Then he turned the handle, and sure enough, the door appeared locked from the inside. At this point, the second mate was concerned the captain would sleep too long, so he went to get a master key, telling first mate Charles Riker of his trouble before heading back to the captain's cabin and unlocking the door. Thus, the second mate would then turn the key, announce his presence, and step inside. And what he found inside was alarming. He found nothing. The captain, it seemed, had left. Confused, he would then fruitlessly search the captain's small room, but in just moments he confirmed that nobody was inside. Further, nothing was really out of place. The bed seemed unused, and the porthole window was tightly closed, as if that mattered, given the porthole was certainly too small for anyone to pass through anyways, especially a large man like Captain Donor. Thus, the second mate would inform the rest of the crew of the missing captain, and begin their search of the rest of the ship. Together, the crew searched the galley, thinking perhaps the captain got hungry, finding 2 firemen in it who claimed they hadn't seen the captain there. Soon, the rest of the freighter was informed about what happened, and literally every room was searched, essentially from top to bottom. Every door, every container, and every crate was checked. Of course, even this search yielded nothing. By the time the O.S. McFarland reached Wisconsin, the captain was clearly gone, and all the crew could do was let authorities know that their captain was missing. The Coast Guard, after being informed, also searched for the captain in the waters of Lake Michigan rather than aboard the ship, first as a rescue effort, but by morning as a body recovery mission, going along the exact same route that the O.S. McFarland had just taken. But, as you might expect, nothing was found. To many, it appeared the captain entered his room and then vanished into thin air, with the only facts that were known at the time being that at 10:20 p.m., Captain Donor retired to his room, that movement was heard from his cabin, and that when they opened his door, he was gone. Captain Donor would never be found. This said, in their prying, authorities did learn something. In interviewing the ship's officers, Port Washington Sheriff Ben Runkle learned that Donor appeared to be in, I quote, a highly nervous state during this voyage, largely because the ship's front and rear compasses weren't functioning correctly, something that made Donor refuse to sleep or rest whatsoever, so that he constantly knew their position. Perhaps related to this, Donor would also tell a ship steward that he wasn't feeling well, but refused to elaborate on the matter, and then asked the steward if they would, I quote, stay in his cabin through the night while he slept so he wasn't left alone. Of course, given this was a strange request, the steward refused to do this. Speculation about what happened also went in many different directions. Some people thought perhaps the captain snuck out of his room, tied heavy weights to himself, and jumped overboard, sinking to the depths of the lake. Others wondered if maybe the captain was done away with by his crew. See, many accounts of this event claim that his door was, I quote, locked from the inside, but then they also go on to claim that the second mate fetched a, I quote, master key, and was able to unlock his door. This is consistent with his door having a deadbolt, meaning even if his door was locked, it certainly could have been unlocked by someone who had it out for him, and he could have been dealt with, let's say. Then, of course, his door could have been locked again, like nothing ever happened, just lacking the captain, of course. Then, as you might expect, there were these supernatural explanations. Some wondered if the captain was taken by some unexplainable force or something, perhaps whatever force governed the Lake Michigan Triangle itself, or some strange time or space phenomenon, trapping him inside the triangle forever. As for contemporary sources, though, their take was that the captain didn't take his own life, and despite the clear distress he was showing to members of his crew, he was, I quote, well respected, and many thought he showed no signs of someone who might jump from the side of the ship. They did, however, agree that he was lost in his own mind or hyper-focused on the compass, taking any steps he could to avoid sleep. Something that we, as humans, all know will make you gradually lose touch with reality, deeply impacting your psyche and ultimately driving you into a sleep deprivation-induced sort of psychosis. With all of this in mind, I wouldn't be surprised if the captain, normally a level-headed individual, might have made some rash decisions 4 days into this voyage from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin. And if I had to make a guess as to what happened, I would say this was either foul play, or more likely that poor Captain Donor took a leap into Lake Michigan's icy waters. Now, with these stories of maritime misadventure behind us, alongside the gales, shifting cargo, and, misadventure, there are tales that claim that some of these less explainable episodes of maritime disaster are caused by something less maritime and a little more Lovecraftian, because for as long as people have crossed Lake Michigan, they've also told stories of things not recorded in shipping logs or Coast Guard reports. Stories of shapes moving beneath the water, of disturbances that don't match the rhythm of wind or waves, and ultimately of something that, as the sailors watch the water below their ship, might occasionally watch them back. See, when European settlers began showing up in the Great Lakes region, in the 1600s and 1700s, it didn't take long for them to start telling stories of strange creatures in the lakes, of Bessie in Lake Erie, of creatures in Lake Ontario, and of a giant snake in Lake Huron. Heck, Lake Superior even had cave monsters. Lake Michigan, of course, wasn't immune from this speculation either, though their monster wouldn't appear in print at least until the 1800s. On August 3rd of 1867, the Daily Ohio Statesman would reprint a Milwaukee, Wisconsin article, which described an encounter 2 men had with, I quote, a giant whale in Lake Michigan. The first man in the story, one Captain McBride, claimed that early in the morning he saw a giant fish resembling a whale, and that it made loud noises, even puffing water into the air through a blowhole, only to sink below the surface when it was approached. Not long after, a tugboat captain observed something similar near the mouth of a river, noting that this creature both swam slowly and ate whatever it came across. This creature, too, let out a sort of moan and then puffed water into the air before sinking into the lake. The tugboat captain tried to get closer, too, but again, he couldn't find it afterwards. In short, if this article is to be believed, two individuals saw something that, I suppose, does sound quite a bit like a whale, relatively close in time to one another. Not long after, a large fish supposedly washed up on Lake Michigan's shore in Wisconsin, apparently with a large chunk bitten out of it. Something many claimed was evidence that a creature of at least 16 feet in length that was, I quote, capable of destroying a boat with ease, was swimming in the lake. On August 16th of 1867, the Manitowoc Pilot shared an article from the Chicago Tribune, in which they discussed an August 5th sighting, starting their story with the statement that Lake Michigan is inhabited by a vast monster, part fish and part serpent, no longer admits of doubt. And this goes on to describe one Josh Mulk's sighting of a creature 5 times the length of his boat off the coast of Hyde Park in Chicago, saying that it was bluish-black and grayish-white near the head of the tail, with a triangular head and with a back that was plated, which he likened to that of a sturgeon. On August 28th, this creature would appear again in the Elk Advocate in Pennsylvania. Here, the paper described the previous appearances, and the creature now grew to 25 feet in length, often showing itself to the crews of tugboats working on the family lake. This creature would often thrash at the water's surface, making the water foamy, and many contemporary sources suggest perhaps this monster should be captured and put on display. And finally, this monster would appear one more time in 1867, this time appearing in a poem written by one Shep P. Smith of Wisconsin, which would be published in the Manitowoc Pilot on September 13th of 1867, titled, "What is it? The Sea Serpent on a Rampage," after which the lake monster would apparently go quiet for 18 years, only to be mentioned again in 1885 by the Portland Daily Press, which claimed that the lake monster showed itself to bathers in Lake Michigan, but also to individuals along the Atlantic coast, saying, "No well-regulated sea serpent ever lacks the ability to appear in at least 4 different places at the same time." After this, not to be drab, but the story shifted from somewhat believable tales of a large creature dwelling in the lake to reports and stories that themselves may have been larger than the monster in the first place. For example, in July of 1987, reports were published of an event which took place 33 miles north of Chicago, where a commissioner of public works said that while along the beach, 2 men in bathing suits ran to him, shouting that there was something in the lake, and this man, Joe Downey, would follow them, and he'd observe something large gliding through the water over 2,000 feet away, and that it was over 30 feet long, with a large black neck and a head out of the water, with fins protruding from its back that were over 4 feet tall. The creature would repeatedly dive underwater, and then resurface feet away, like it was chasing something, or playing. Downey and the 2 swimmers saw the creature for between 20 minutes and a half an hour, before it finally disappeared, and they claimed that during the encounter, schools of large fish approached the shore, as if trying to escape the creature by moving into shallow water. Further, it was noted that the prior day, there was, sadly, a deceased dog along the beach near where this occurred, but as evidenced by the claw marks in the sand, it seemed that something large had crawled onto shore, and then dragged this dog back into the water to consume it. They also noted, I quote, "It was clear that no cows had gotten onto the beach and taken the carcass. I mean, I'm not sure I ever would have considered cows were responsible for this, but thank you, I guess." And these wild changes continued. In 1904, the creature gained yellow stripes, and 4 women saw it, claiming it was 50 feet long, with many wondering if their ice cream sodas had been drugged. And in 1911, a fisherman saw the serpent, telling many that it was well over 100 feet long. In the years following the early, more dramatic sightings, like that of Colonel Green, the so-called Lake Michigan monster seemed to fade from prominence, though it never disappeared entirely. reports shifted north towards Milwaukee, where encounters described a large sea serpent-like creature with a raised head, thick body, and an almost deliberate presence in the water. Fishermen, sailors, and even a passerby on a bridge all claimed glimpses of something moving beneath the surface, something too large to be easily dismissed. But as these sightings became less frequent, public interest waned and newspapers grew skeptical, often ridiculing witnesses rather than investigating them. Over time, as many creatures do, this Lake Michigan monster slipped from headline to folklore, where it rests today. By the mid-20th century, the idea of a true monster in Lake Michigan had been largely replaced by more modern and arguably more sensational fears, chief among them being the persistent legend of a 1955 shark attack involving a young boy named George Lawson. Though never verified, the story gained traction later, fueled by a hastily assembled book capitalizing on the shark frenzy that was inspired by Jaws. And while biologically improbable, the tale blurred the line between fact and fiction, embedding itself in regional lore. Even real-world oddities, like the discovery of a small shark carcass in 1969, only deepened the fear. At least until it was revealed to be an elaborate prank, reminding everyone just how easily fear of these monsters in Lake Michigan could be manufactured. And yet, despite debunking and skepticism, the stories never truly started. In recent years, alleged sightings, grainy photos, ambiguous videos, and fleeting shapes in stormy water have reignited speculation about what might live beneath the lake's surface. Now, if you ask me, it's friggin' 2026 and my crappy old iPhone can take videos that would pass for an indie flick 10 years ago, so personally, I find grainy videos a bit unconvincing. Thus, my personal take is that probably this is just a misidentified sturgeon, or maybe drifting debris on the lake. That said, the legend of the Lake Michigan monster is difficult to prove and even harder to ignore. Now, given we just discussed a handful of nautical disasters that seem to have occurred on Lake Michigan, you might be thinking that flying over this triangle seems to be safer than floating over it, which, given thousands of flights pass over Lake Michigan every year, is probably correct. However, not every aircraft that passes over the lake has had such luck. And one in particular, much like the Thomas Hume or Le Griffin, may very well have been stolen into the lake's cold depths. In this light, it was on June 23rd of 1950 that at about 6:10 p.m., Northwest Orient DC-4, Flight 2501, departed New York City's LaGuardia Airport, bound for Seattle with 55 passengers and 3 crew aboard. It would be making stops at Minneapolis and in Spokane, Washington along the way. That evening wasn't ideal flying weather either, as there were thunderstorm warnings all across the Midwest. That said, many aircraft still took off and opted to fly over the region. This flight, to be fair, would carry on without drama for hours, but as it neared the western Great Lakes, such as Lake Michigan specifically, the pilot, one Robert Lind, requested to descend from 6,000 to about 4,000 feet to avoid turbulence, something he would ask again over Cleveland between 9 and 10 p.m., which he got approval for. He also turned south towards Lake Michigan to dodge a reported storm cell. This decision, sadly, many believe caused them to enter a severe squall line. Thus, at 11:13 p.m., Flight 2501 made its last radio transmission, requesting air traffic control that they descend to 2,500 feet for better visibility, a request that was denied due to a conflict with an outbound Milwaukee flight. This was the last time anybody ever heard from them. The next folks knew, sometime between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, witnesses on shore between South Haven and Benton Harbor reported to hear a low-flying plane, followed by a bright flash of light and an explosion over Lake Michigan. By morning, Coast Guard patrols who promptly went out to administer rescue efforts had found oil slicks and a small debris field about 18 miles northwest of Benton Harbor, as well as wreckage and human remains, which were recovered in the days that followed, with some of it washing up on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. That said, the fuselage, like many of the ships we've discussed, was swallowed by the lake, and to this day, nobody's ever found it. There's of course no doubt that the plane crashed into Lake Michigan. likely because of a powerful downdraft or microburst. However, while this instance is tragic, no aerial phenomenon over Lake Michigan is more mysterious than that of the 1994 Lake Michigan UFO. Now, as I said, thousands of planes fly over Lake Michigan every year, so lights in the sky near the lake's coast are nothing out of the ordinary. However, what Western Michigan residents observed on the night of March 8, 1994, was anything but. That evening, after dark, about 300 residents of towns in Holland, Muskegon, and Elgin counties reported strange lights in the sky that were oddly consistent, between 4 and 6 glowing objects that flickered red, green, blue, and white, I quote, like Christmas trees, over Lake Michigan, and moved erratically near its shores, with sightings lasting over an hour. Our first witness in this story is one Lee Lambert, a sports writer and editor for the Holland Sentinel newsprint, who, while leaving a basketball game at Holland High School, I quote, saw a string of lights over Holland High School, noting that his attention was drawn to the sky by an audible humming, which he assumed was a landing plane. But when he looked up, instead of conventional running lights, he observed a long row of red and white lights, almost like, I quote, a Christmas tree once again, which he thought were roughly 100 feet above the ground. That night, because of this, he went back to the newsroom and told his colleagues, but of course, nobody believed him. Thus, like many others, he would speak to a Muskegon Chronicle investigative reporter named Mike Walsh, a reporter for one of their competitors, which his boss wasn't too happy about, and he would tell him his story. In large part, due to stories like Lee Lambert's, Mike was able to break the news on this case. Now, the saga of Mike breaking this news is a bit funny if I do say so myself. Walsh, you see, was not a resident alien guy. Rather, he was a very serious reporter, a courtroom reporter for the county. And my sense is that when his manager asked him to investigate UFOs, he might have been a little bit offended. Regardless, he walked the line and did what he was told, calling around to local dispatchers and submitting Freedom of Information Act requests. Eventually, he actually got his hands on an Ottawa County 911 recording from March 8th, and at least for Mike, this sort of changed everything. In these recordings, he didn't just hear jokers, he heard people that sounded afraid, and he believed they were seeing something different. Further, it seemed whatever these folks were seeing, it could manipulate its shape, as many individuals saw lights traveling in a row, while others observed a V formation over the lake. As noted, there were many other witnesses too. For instance, there was Cindy Prava, a resident who lived roughly 20 miles north of Holland. On March 8th, while on her corded phone, because yes, I needed to be reminded that those existed, she claims she observed bright lights that surprised her, and that she thought they were the size of the full moon, and that it wasn't a helicopter, as well as that the circular lights had well-defined edges that aligned just above her tree. At first, at the very least, she thought these lights were a single entity, but after watching for a bit, she noticed that one light sort of trailed off, wandering away while the others remained. There was also Missy Broderick, the logistics manager at Channel 3 News on the evening of March 8th. This night, while she didn't necessarily observe anything herself, she noted that they got over 50 calls, far more phone calls than usual, and that they were specifically in reference to strange bright lights being observed by locals in the area. This was so strange to her that she actually reached out to the Kalamazoo Battle Creek International Airport and asked them if they knew what was going on. She was actually put in touch with an air traffic controller, who confirmed they saw aberrations on radar over the lake, but they didn't know what they were and couldn't comment further. Over the following days, she'd interview witnesses in Holland and Grand Haven about this incident, finding their observations to be startlingly similar. Then, of course, there's perhaps the most famous aspect of this case, the fact that a representative from the National Weather Service was one of the key witnesses. On the night of March 8, 1994, once again, Jack Bouchon was the on-site meteorologist at the now-closed National Weather Service station at the Muskegon County Airport. Typically, this job was, at risk of sounding rude, uneventful or boring. It involved answering the phone, taking weather observations, and sort of generally operating the radar. Jack, in interviews, remembers this evening being cold and calm. That is, until the phone rang. Of course, when he picked up, he He assumed it would be a quick weather confirmation and not much more. That said, instead of a colleague or an individual working at the airport, it was the county dispatcher who actually asked him to check the radar to see if there was anything weird showing up over southern Ottawa County. Thus, Jack would throw his WSR-74C weather radar into manual mode, and he'd begin scanning the region to the southeast, upon which he claimed he observed a strange object light up his screen, something he'd relayed to dispatchers. I quote, "I knew I was looking at something highly unusual, not an airplane, either aircraft in formation or the biggest airplane I've ever seen on radar. This object, after being observed, changed position and altitude frequently, and rapidly. And when he was able to track it, he observed it was moving from southwest Michigan to over Lake Michigan in a sort of geometric pattern, eventually disappearing from radar. To him, he thought this object made its way deep over Lake Michigan, far from the coast, to the only area of the lake with mostly open water at this point because it was a very cold winter, and much of the lake was covered in ice. By his own account, too, Bouchon was told to abstain from discussing this with the media, and his supervisors downplayed Bouchon's experience in interviews. He claimed that when he tried to explain what he saw to them, I quote, "they didn't even want to listen, and if he wrote them a message, it's like they didn't want to read it." Thus, in an effort to distance himself from this event, he actually transferred to Atlanta, where he still worked upon unsolved mysteries, airing his stories. Of course, since this, we've learned a lot about UFOs and UAPs, including the fact that the Pentagon, for years, has had video evidence and eyewitness accounts from U.S. airmen seeing objects in the sky that pretty much align perfectly with the craft seen by Jack this evening. As such, in later interviews, Bouchon has claimed he felt vindicated by the declassified aerial phenomena from 2020, and that he thought those strange craft, proven to be true by the Pentagon, were similar to what he observed on that cold March night. This UFO sighting, as you expect, is just the most famous of many UFOs over Lake Michigan, a trend that is in no way dead today. And if you ask some, these strange flying objects, whatever they may be, may at least partially be to blame for the string of disappearances and shipwrecks that have occurred over this lake. Further, I think it's worth a quick note that even if you don't step foot on Lake Michigan, if you just get a little too close to it, you might still feel a bit of its influence. And nowhere will you feel this influence more than in the many lighthouses dotted along Lake Michigan's coasts. Lighthouses meant to guide those on perilous waters to safety, but sometimes that end up becoming perilous places in their own right. Perhaps the most famous among these haunted lights is the Sichua Point Lighthouse in Gulliver, Michigan. This lighthouse I've discussed before, and it's located far north in Michigan, acting as a northern beacon to those sailors who recently passed through the Straits of Mackinac. This lighthouse is 78 feet tall, having been built in 1895 to replace a temporary light that was built 3 years earlier to accommodate the growing number of ships passing through the region carrying iron. Back in the day, this light was sort of a visual waypoint between those two other lights, the Helena Island Light and the Poverty Island Light. However, these days, at least by many accounts I read, it's the only remaining active lighthouse on the shores of Lake Michigan. The complex isn't just the lighthouse either. It also includes a 2-story home, some outbuildings, and a museum today. These days, the light is automated, but back in the day, it was manned by a lighthouse keeper. And it's well known, lighthouse keepers are not immortal. Therefore, if you visit, you might run into one of those old keepers and experience some strange things. To start, the place is supposedly haunted by one Captain Joseph Willie Townsend, who was appointed keeper in 1902 and passed away in 1910. Now, there's lots of tales that speak of lighthouse keepers passing away in falls or in storms as they try to aid seafarers. But luckily for this captain, or perhaps unluckily for him, he passed away from lung disease, as he was an avid cigar smoker. Now, this part might be a bit embellished, but I actually think it's the truth. The story goes, as he passed away in the winter, and the soils were too frozen, and the outdoor air too cold to bury him, the family temporarily embalmed him, and actually put him in the walls of the lighthouse cellar for 3 weeks, where he would remain too cold to decay. A time period during which I think the old keeper decided he liked the place enough to stay. Nowadays, because of this, he's one of the ghosts that haunts this place. And if you see a man in the lighthouse with a big bushy beard, you might have seen old Captain Townsend. He's also blamed for reports of dishes flying around the kitchen. I don't know, maybe he was mad about an apple pie crust being too wet or something. And apparently his most common haunt is a second-floor mirror that sometimes shows his image behind guests who look in it, if you believe the stories at least. It's also said another later lighthouse keeper, William Blanchard, had a wife that is a frequent flyer at the lighthouse now. William held this position for 31 years, and his wife sadly passed away while he was working there. And like the previous captain, she was actually placed in a cold spot on the premises to freeze and preserve her until spring. This woman is named Mary, and also haunts the place, and she's known to be a frequent source of EVPs. As you'd expect, she basically only manifests as a female voice from what I've seen. Although, I guess on some ghost hunter YouTube channels, they say that in the winter, on cold days, she likes to take a walk outside. Perhaps it reminds her of being preserved or something, I don't know. Then there's the Holland Harbor Lighthouse, or Big Red as many call it, a name given to it because it is big and red. This lighthouse dates back to 1870, a few decades after the completion of Holland Harbor. Here, the lighthouse keeper, who only earned just over $500 a year, was tasked with walking to this wooden lighthouse from his home along what was back then just a catwalk, and of course, placing his lamp under a magnifying device to signal passing sailors, or blowing a fish horn for them when the fog was too thick to see the light. Now, sadly, unlike the Sishwa Lighthouse, there are no named hauntings here. But when I visited Holland last summer, I knew I had to take a jaunt down to Makatawa to see this place. And, of course, I poked the brain of a couple of poor locals about whether or not this place had any stories. I promise I don't harass locals too much. Now, this might be hyper-local, but here's what I was told. For starters, occasionally the little windows underneath this lighthouse's arched roof will show lights flickering at night, as if someone with a lantern is walking back and forth. Then, perhaps, even stranger, one woman I was speaking to named Martha actually said that on one occasion, she was watching the sunset by the Holland Harbor Lighthouse with her husband, and that after it set and got dark, she and her husband saw a bright light in the distance over Lake Michigan. At first, she said it looked like a plane, but then it got brighter and more intense for just a second or two, as if making a signal. She, again, thought little of this, until, lo and behold, just a few seconds later, she claimed that the Holland Harbor Lighthouse's light almost responded by also similarly flashing bright for just a moment. Now, who knows? Maybe this most likely was some sort of ship hailing the lighthouse and the lighthouse responding, even though, as far as I'm aware, it isn't manned anymore. That said, Martha's interpretation was that this was some sort of reaction the lighthouse had without prompting to something a little more, let's say, extraterrestrial, because shortly after she saw this, that little light in the distance dipped under the horizon. Perhaps one of those little blips in reality, caused by the Lake Michigan Triangle we've been talking about all this time. And of course, how could I forget the South Haven Lighthouse? As a quick aside, when I grew up in Tennessee, we didn't really go to the beach in Florida, Georgia, or the Carolinas much, like many Southerners. Rather, in the summer, we'd trek northward to South Haven, Michigan, where my direct and extended family all converged and rented this very house just steps away from Lake Michigan. Yes, I know I'm really a lucky guy to have been able to spend time here with my family, but little did I know, I was standing just a couple thousand steps away from one of Lake Michigan's most haunted attractions, the South Haven Light. This lighthouse, perched upon South Haven's South Pier, was first built as a wooden tower in 1859, back when the area was a particular hotbed for ship traffic related to lumber, coal, and grain shipments. By the 1870s, of course, this wooden lighthouse sort of deteriorated, though, as they do. Thus, in 1872, a new lighthouse was designed to be made of brick, and the tower was designed to be more robust, with a focal point about 100 feet above lake level, and a nearby keeper's house. One of the lighthouse keepers here was a man named James S. Donahue, a man who, during the Battle of the Wilderness during the Civil War, lost his leg, and as such, at the age of 32, in April of 1874, he was appointed keeper of the South Haven Light. Thus, for 40 years, he would attend to this often frozen light, saving many lives over the years, and without fail, even though he lacked a leg, he would make the daily 75-foot walk from his keeper's house to the lighthouse, across what was then just a wooden walkway, no matter what the conditions were. That said, when you have a reliable peg-legged keeper, it's apparently hard to keep him quiet, even after death. Those individuals who, today, wander down South Haven's pier towards this light claim that from time to time, they hear the sound of wooden crutches contacting the ground inside of the lighthouse, of rhythmic tapping, and sometimes the sound of grunting and doors opening. Of course, they say this is old Keeper Donahue, maintaining his old post even to this day. Clearly, it seems that Lake Michigan's coast, while perhaps not quite as strange as the water itself, likes to hold on to those departed in the past, and a bit poetically, it seems to like to keep these old souls busy, keeping the movements on the lake going as they did when these folks were alive. Now, trust me, there are dozens, if not hundreds, more supposedly haunted lighthouses that dot Lake Michigan's coast, but for this video, I thought I'd give you a quick snack on that, to demonstrate that even if you're near the coast, this lake has a knack for exuding its strangeness upon you. And finally, within Lake Michigan, there are strange phenomena as well, perhaps natural, or maybe not, that make people wonder what exactly was going on here thousands of years ago, and if maybe Lake Michigan's history is a little more complex than we'd otherwise believe. For instance, in 2007, a mile-long line and cluster of stones were discovered on the lakebed by archaeology professor Mark Hawley of Northwestern Michigan College and his colleague Brian Abbott, as they were sonar scanning Grand Traverse Bay. Here, while doing this, they detected a circular stone formation on the lakebed, and to them, their sonar and the satellite imagery they used made it look like something was purposefully arranged. And while Mark Hawley did provide a sound scientific statement on what this arrangement of stones was, well, media took it another direction, reporting on these stones as Lake Michigan's Stonehenge. Thus, rapidly, threads began to appear across the internet, proposing this Stonehenge was a source of mysterious energy, an ancient energy vortex, or a marker of a ley line, and perhaps that this structure, and others unfound that were just like it within the lake, were actually the cause of shipwrecks, plane disappearances, and compass malfunctions, the causes of the ship and plane wrecks we discussed earlier in this video. And maybe, some even said it was a relic of an old alien installation, maybe even related to the UFOs we discussed. Another cluster of myths leans into lost civilizations and prehistoric mystery. Online posts and viral articles described the stones as 9 to 10,000 year old ceremonial complexes built by an advanced ancient culture, sometimes even comparing it directly to Stonehenge in purpose and sophistication. There's even the frequently repeated claims that one of the rocks bears a carving of a mastodon, which gets spun into stories about Ice Age hunters with surprisingly advanced artistic or architectural capabilities. Or, in more fringe versions, a forgotten high-tech civilization wiped out by a cataclysm. In even more imaginative corners of the internet, especially forums and Reddit, the myths become openly fantastical. People joke, or I hope they're joking, but I think they're actually half-seriously speculating, that the arrangement could function like a time travel gateway, like the darn wardrobe to Narnia, or that it marks the entrance to a hidden underground world. Others blend it with broader conspiracy culture, suggesting cover-ups by archaeologists and the government hiding proof of ancient civilizations, basically the plot of One Piece at this point. Of course, if the media had read any further than rock formations on bed of Lake Michigan before they wrote a tabloid article about this, the takeaway probably would have been different. In reality, while this structure is certainly fascinating and interesting, it can be rationally explained. Dr. Mark Hawley hypothesizes that these stone alignments were actually set by prehistoric people to trap or perhaps channel caribou herds, back when this site would have been above water about 15,000 years ago, because Lake Michigan's water level was 400 feet lower back then, dating this site to about the end of the Ice Age. Credence to this theory comes in the form of a similar structure that's actually being studied by Dr. John O'Shea from the University of Michigan, who found a structure just like this in Lake Huron, and is actually funded by the National Science Foundation to study it. He hypothesizes, similarly, that it might be a prehistoric driveline for herding caribou. And this site is relatively well documented, and I'm pretty sure published. And because it's well explained, it hasn't drawn nearly as much attention as the Lake Michigan site. Also, there's the matter of this not really even being a Stonehenge, as you think of the one across the Atlantic. For starters, there's no hinge on this site, which refers to a circular enclosure made of a bank, raised earth, and a ditch. If you didn't know, Stonehenge itself actually refers to the circular earthwork enclosure that surrounds the site, not the stone circle. The stones themselves were added later, and ended up becoming the primary focus of those who consider the site today, or at least lay individuals. Perhaps most importantly, too, the stones that comprise these lines are relatively small compared to European standing stones. Also, as for that mastodon carving folks tend to bring up a lot, it may very well just be a fracture in the rock or a mineral stain, according to Mark Hawley. Nothing that proves lost history. Currently, while this spurs up plenty of controversy in its own right, this location is only known to be located in Grand Traverse Bay. But beyond that, its location is kept confidential to prevent looting, and funds are being raised to do a more proper investigation of the site with submersibles and drilling. But for now, there's no definitive conclusion. My 2 cents, I probably buy the archaeology lens more than the source of the Lake Michigan Triangle lens on this one. Then, too, there were some mysterious holes that were found a few years ago off the coast of Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Now, first off, media painted these holes as mysterious, shocking, and that nobody can explain them. And other YouTube channels presenting these holes often show animated photos of holes at the bottom of the lake with thumbnails like, "Something is down there," or "Lake Michigan is doomed," clearly hinting that whatever these holes were, they were something nefarious, and discussions of them across the internet suggest that possibly something unknown lives in them. That said, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but these holes are, in my opinion, they're interesting, but they're nothing particularly unique. For background, in 2021 through 2024, NOAA-led researchers discovered these holes, again, about 14 miles off the coast of Sheboygan. That said, the word hole might make you think of a cavern or cave, but in reality, these are probably best described as craters, as they're about 300 to 600 feet wide and about 450 feet deep. In reality, they're just massive sinkholes that were formed when acidic groundwater back in the day dissolved subterranean limestone, causing these ceilings of what were essentially caves to collapse. They're just karst collapses. Funny enough, just like the bottomless lakes we covered in New Mexico 2 weeks ago. And as for what lives inside of them, well, as far as researchers can tell, there are no lake monsters, that's for sure. Rather, there are shrimp, or quagga mussels, in them, and some other hardy creatures that can survive in the 38-degree temperatures and higher pressures of these holes. And with that, we reach the end of our journey across the Lake Michigan Triangle, a place rife with compelling disappearances, hidden underwater features, with haunted coasts, and even the odd dancing lights in the sky. And as someone who spends a lot of my time in Michigan, I think I'll give my 2 cents at answering the age-old questions. Is there truly strangeness in the region that stretches from Manitowoc, Wisconsin, to Ludington, to Benton Harbor? For starters, regarding the nautical disasters, well, yes and no. On one hand, disasters like this are just sort of inevitable to some extent, but I do find it odd that Le Griffin, for instance, was the first real boat to ever sail the Great Lakes, and managed, in the process, to not only sink, but to become the mysterious white whale that it is. I feel similar regarding the disappearance of Captain Donor. It's absolutely no surprise that it's possible a man could simply leave his room, lock the door, and leap into the icy waters of Lake Michigan. However, what I find the creepiest is that the difficulty and stress of navigating this lake would lead someone that was otherwise seemingly happy and healthy to do this so quickly. Then there's the case of the Lake Michigan UFO. I don't like to be sensational, but in a case like that, with strange lights, odd movements, and over 300 witnesses, my mind can only really accept 3 explanations. Perhaps most likely is that there was a group of pilots playing a prank as they practiced flying in formation, like we observed with the Hudson Valley UFO. Next, if they weren't a group of pilots with a sense of humor, I would guess these were probably experimental aircraft, if we are to believe the accounts of the National Weather Service representative. And on that topic, there's certainly some back and forth about whether weather radar can accurately track aircraft in the first place, which, as someone who uses weather radar data from time to time, I'm sort of inclined to say no, they can't do this with precision, but that's a topic for another day. Third, of course, if not experimental aircraft or pranksters, given the number of witnesses, I'm pretty sure this basically qualifies as Michigan's own Phoenix Lights, a mass sighting of lights that, to be clear, offers no explanation whatsoever, even 30 years later, and remains unexplainable. As for the oddities, I think I've already given my take pretty thoroughly on them. These generally seem to be man-made or natural structures that are somewhat clear in purpose. The sinkholes in Lake Michigan are largely just karst collapses, and the stone arrangements in Lake Michigan seem to be nothing more than an old caribou herding tool arranged by people tens of thousands of years ago. Probably not a landing strip for the aforementioned aliens, even if I do sort of buy the whole alien angle. Oh, and those ghosts? Well, all I'm going to say is I love a good ghost story, and whether or not you believe the Lake Michigan Triangle creates a propensity for spirits to linger after death, well, I'll leave that up to you. Otherwise, though, even if you take exception to paranormal explanations for Lake Michigan's strangeness, there's absolutely no denying that, as the natives implied in their history, it's a place that, if you don't respect it thoroughly, behaves almost like a moody child. If you don't read its cues, one day, sure, it might be a benevolent force, offering you comfort, food in the form of fish, and even fresh water. But the next, as you sail it, it might send an unanticipated gale your way, sending you to the lake's bottom. You've got to respect it, honor it, and treat it like it's alive, or inevitably, it will send you to its rocky depths. With that, though, I hope you enjoyed the stories. As always, if you want to see more like this and support the channel, a like, a subscription, and a comment are always free, and it goes a long way towards keeping this channel relevant in the eyes of the YouTube gods. Also, it'll help my humble charge towards 1 million subscribers. If you could help me out on that, I would be very thankful. Otherwise, whether you were kayaking on Lake Michigan and came upon a ghost ship full of Christmas trees, or if, as you stood at the beach in Holland State Park, you saw a light blinking in the distance and the nearby long-abandoned lighthouse blinked back, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.